do companies go about making a kind of a cross-functional cohort and even an intergenerational cohort, right? And that's where I like to kind of ask my second question. How do you see the young Gen Z contributing in this process? I mean, that's the big question about for our episode here, to say that, do you sense that, should companies just ignore them? Because there are two sides to the story. There's one view that says it is so far tech savvy. I mean, much more than maybe, some of the elder generations, without any offense to anyone. But at the same time, they're relatively inexperienced, right? So do we perhaps use, their context of just knowing technology so much more better, perhaps, in this process? What have you seen? What do companies do?
Yeah, so Gen Z has an extraordinary advantage in being a truly digital native generation. And so I think the opportunity to be able to leverage those insights and perspectives is absolutely critical. So there are lots of organizations that I would say fall typically into that more conservative or bureaucratic sort of, category, that have really challenged themselves by trying to say, how do we bring these voices forward? So one quick example, when I was working with Interpol, one of the things that they were really trying to invest in and to bring out and to help to support, specifically police chiefs with, was the development of reverse mentoring programs. So how do you bring in a younger Gen Z a policeman or policewoman who can actually support a chief to have a conversation about technology, to think about, what does it mean to use this in different ways? And of course, to bring out not only those skills, but also those perspectives as well, to enrich that thinking and that decision making.
Right. And so let's flip it now. If I'm a young Gen Z, right? I'm 24, 25, and obviously I know a lot of these tools. I know technology. I'm very comfortable with them. What advice, or what would you tell them? In other words, that's a generation, rightly or wrongly, leaving aside the stereotypes, are perhaps like happy with what they're seeing now. A 25-year-old is probably not saying that, hey, I'm not worried about, what may happen in this company 30 years from now, even though they're very passionate about climate and sustainability and all these other things, right? So what advice would you have? In other words, can they read up more, or can they become a little more serious, so that, their reverse mentoring starts becoming, a much more people see that a little more seriously?
Yeah, so I think most importantly is, you really have to meet, different people where they're at. So I think, thinking about the types of issues that Gen Z is passionate about, and how you might bring that forward, or how organizations might even think about a project or a program that is as radical as this, like reverse mentoring, is really to be able to say, okay, what is the value that this is going to create? And how is this going to not only bring something forward for the organization, but of course the people that are involved in the process as well. And time again, really what these types of experiences build, and what the research is really suggesting, is that it is about trust, it is about psychological safety. And another aspect of that is, can you actually create experiences that makes Gen Z want to stay? Because certainly in lots of corporate spaces, Gen Z is quite nomadic with regards to its, professional sort of trajectory. So the idea is, how do you actually create this attachment to the organization? What does it mean to establish a bond and to build those? And so I think these types of experiences can help to build that. And so, from the perspective of what Gen Z needs to do, clearly it is about trying to establish on the front end, okay, what does my relationship with this organization look like? How do I understand, and what am I really investing and committing myself to? And sometimes, of course, that's, hard to make clear on both sides. But I think the more that can happen, the more that these types of experiences can actually pay greater dividends.
Sure. And what have you seen, John? I mean, whether it's specifically talking about foresight, or this exercise of looking out, but in your experience, considering that you work with so many senior people around the world, and we're talking about Gen Z, right? I mean, do you sense, or have you facilitated? My sense would be to have an external person who is a little more objective can facilitate. But do you sense that companies are succeeding in trying to bring intergenerational collective intelligence together, right? So, do you sense that there is progress there, or there are some success stories? Because a lot of the work, or a lot of the companies that I work with, right? I mean, this debate about hybrid, right? People are just saying the two extremes, right? Either I quit or I come to work. And so, what do you see? Is there a role that a manager has to play? In other words, do they have to be much more supporting? At the same time, the Gen Z has to be much more respecting of who's on the other side. What do you see?
Yeah, so basically, because a lot of organizations are caught in this cycle, which is the president or the present moment, and what we expect in the future is far more turbulent. So actually, there's an inherent drive and desire to be more conservative, right? We have to go to what we know. We have to peel back. But of course, then there is a greater feeling that, well, we need to maybe do something and think further about the future and how do we do that? So it's constantly this tension that you brought out earlier between, the future and what might be able to be versus the demands of the now. And so I think ultimately I wanted to highlight that, because when I think more and more about how Gen Z is operating in the landscape of not only the corporate environment, but even more broadly, it is about trying to establish these spaces so that there is shared learning and discovery. And I think that's what's really critical from my perspective, is thinking about like how to actually create that space and how to make that space something that's interesting and intriguing. And so I think from my perspective, and a lot of the work that I'm trying to do, is how to be able to establish that. Now, I'm always the external, which is to say that, my job is to help create that outside perspective. And I think actually the one thing that Gen Z really has that maybe doesn't get enough attention is they already think in systems. They think about things in the context of ecologies. So that means actually from an organizational perspective, you need outsiders. You need different parts of the ecology, different perspectives, different points of view. And so there is this space where actually having that and bringing that forward and not just getting locked into that groupthink is really critical.